Okay, welcome back from the break. Let's take a look at the two concept check questions and then get on to the last section talking about the deuterostomia, focusing specifically on the echinodermata. So, explain how nematode and annelid worm body plans differ. Both of them are tubes inside tubes. They have a complete digestive tract with a mouth and an anus and a cylinder connecting them together. So in that sense, their body plans are exactly the same. They are tubes within tubes. But remember, the nematode worm is a hemocoel body plan, or pseudocoelomate, to use the old term, where you don't have a true body cavity. It's not derived from the mesoderm, it's derived from the blastocele. They have a single layer of muscle, runs longitudinally from anterior to posterior. It only allows the animal to whip its body from side to side. It does have a cuticle around the outside because it is an ecdysozoan, but the body is not segmented. It is, however, a bilateral. When you look at the annelid worms, again, it is a tube inside a tube, a digestive tract that runs the full length of the body suspended inside the body cavity. This time, however, it is a true body cavity. It is a coelom derived from mesoderm tissue. There are also two layers of muscle. One is longitudinal, one is circular. And now, because the body is segmented, each segment contains its own complement of longitudinal and circular muscle. This is what allows each segment to contract and expand and allows for the rhythmic contraction and expansion of the worm's body to drive itself forwards, in the case of the earthworm, when it's burrowing through the soil. Inside the segment, there can also be a degree of specialization. So remember, at the anterior end, there is a substantive level of specialization in terms of the circulatory system. There are 5 ring canals that work as hearts, and the circulatory system is a completely closed circulatory system. So unlike the nematode, where the fluid would be referred to as hemolymph, the fluid that's moving through the circulatory system of an annelid worm is blood. So there are some ways in which the body plans of an annelid worm and a nematode worm differ from each other. Outline 2 adaptations that have allowed insects to be so successful in terrestrial habitats. There are 3 that you could mention here. One is flight, which allows insects to travel over long distances and also to occupy habitats that are inaccessible by animals that lack the ability to fly, and also to access resources. A second one is the exoskeleton, which provides a waterproof coating and allows the animals to move around on dry ground without dehydrating. It also provides them with a level of protection from predation. The third is their respiratory system, specifically for insects, the spiracle and tracheal system. The little openings in the exoskeleton that lead to the spiracles, the trachea, that penetrate into the body of the animal and allow for gas exchange via diffusion, because the tracheal system penetrates into the body and means that the cells are only 2, maybe 3 cells away from any trachea, and therefore access to oxygen via the trachea and the spiracles, those openings in the exoskeleton. So those are the 3 major adaptations that have allowed insects to be successful in terrestrial circumstances. So onwards to the deuterostomia. So the deuterostomia, as far as phyla that we are interested in contains two large phyla, the Echinodermata, which are the sea stars and sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and the like, and phylum Chordata, our own phylum, which of course is the one in which we find vertebrata ourselves. So as deuterostomes, not surprisingly, we find that the developmental characteristics are the same in terms of early embryological development. Radial cleavage, a true body cavity, developed as an enterocoelous body cavity, developed from the archenteron, a pocketing from the archenteron, and of course, the bespoke feature, the fact that the mouth forms from the second opening, not from the blastopore. The blastopore becomes the anus in the primitive digestive tract and identifies where the anus will be in the mature adult. So those are characteristics that both chordates and echinoderms share as a consequence of being deuterostomes. So let's take a look at the echinoderms, because this is the last clade that we're going to address in this presentation. Chordates will be addressed in the next chapter, chapter 34, and the last chapter. So when we look at sea stars and the other echinoderms, the thing that strikes us is that they do not look like bilaterals. They have a radial symmetry, and typically it's a 5-way radial symmetry. But that's because the larval stage undergoes a metamorphic process that changes its larval bilateral form into the adult radial form. The name actually comes from the outer covering. Echinodermata means spiny skin, and that's because underlying the epidermis is a skeleton made up of calcium carbonate reinforced plates that overlap and support the thin epidermal layer that overlays this. And because it is somewhat rough, it leads to a spiny appearance or spiky appearance as far as the adult form is concerned. What is characteristic of some members of the clade, not all of them, is the fact that they have a unique means of locomotion in the form of hydraulically actuated tube feet. These are connected to a series of hydraulic, the note says canals. I'm not sure that I necessarily like the term canal, but a series of hydraulic pipes, I guess, that are connected to a unique opening, which in sea stars is on the aboral side of the organism. So you may recall that aboral is the side that does not contain the mouth, and this is the side of the sea star that faces up. The opening is covered by a grid-like arrangement that serves as a filter to keep particles out of the hydraulic system. And this opening is called a madreporite. And that's where the water is drawn in to the system. It initially enters into a ring canal that circles around the periphery of the central circular disc of the sea stars. And then there are radial canals or radial tubes that radiate out from this central circular ring canal into each of the arms that then branch out to each of the feet in the arm. And there are 2 rows of feet in the arms of sea stars. So it is a contraction of muscles surrounding a little bulb on the top of the feet called the ampulla that forces water into the tubes, which forces the flat surface on the bottom of the foot to press down on the substratum that it is trying to walk on. And that in turn also triggers the release of a sticky material that anchors the foot to the surface while it needs to engage with the surface to allow the echinoderm to lever itself forwards using the rhythmic movement of these feet on each of the legs to move it in the direction that it wants to move in. Gas exchange is typically done through the skin or through a gill-like arrangement, but typically it's done through the skin. So when we take a look at the classes to which phylum Echinodermata has been divided, there is, depending on which resource you look at and who did the classification and when the classification was done, possibly 5 or 6 classes. I noticed that in my note, I say 6 classes. I probably ought to modify that because, as you'll see, one of the classes has been rolled into the other, and it's actually in this first class that we see that. So sea stars belong to class Asteroidea. Aster refers to the star-like arrangement. So these are the ones that typically have the 5-way radial symmetry, having 5 arms, but that's not necessarily a given for all members of the sea stars. If you take a look at the video that I posted in the resource section from The Shape of Life about a sea star called Pycnopodia, this is a very large predatory sea star, and it can have up to 20 to 30 arms. So while many sea stars have the classic 5-way radial symmetry, that's not necessarily true of all sea stars. And sometimes it's very, very hard to identify the 5 arms because of the nature of the structure of the animal. One of the remarkable things about sea stars is that if you cut them up into pieces, but you retain a piece of the central disk attached to the piece, that piece can regenerate all the missing parts. And this has actually led to an interesting situation in California with the abalone fishermen, because abalone fishermen have viewed sea stars as being major competitors for the abalones, because sea stars do prey on bivalves, oysters and clams and the like, and abalones are right there amongst the things that they apparently do like to eat. And so when the abalone divers found sea stars, they would bring them back up onto their boats and they would cut them up into pieces using the very, very sharp knives they used to lever the abalones off the rocks they attached to. Then they would throw the pieces back overboard, not realizing that by cutting the sea stars up into pieces, any piece that retained part of the central disk was simply going to regenerate into a new sea star. They were actually actively promoting an increase in the number of sea stars, the exact opposite to what they were trying to do. So here you can see the classic sea star form with the 5-way radial symmetry, the circular canal in the center of the disk, the radial canals that radiate out into the arms, driving the tubes, the ampulla sitting on top, the podium, which is the actual arm / foot of the leg, and down here on the flat surface of the podium is the region that presses down on the substratum that they're walking on and triggers the release of the sticky material from the podium to allow it to grip onto the surface as they drive themselves forwards. Sea stars are dioecious. There are males and females, but you cannot pick the difference by looking internally because the gonads look exactly the same. Of course, they know the difference, but they do release their gametes into the water column. And as we've seen previously, the eggs and the sperm recognize each other through the sperm recognition proteins, and that allows fertilization to continue. One of the unique things that sea stars have is a 2-compartment stomach. There is the cardiac stomach, and I think I'm going to have to look in the book to get the part because the name is escaping me right now. I would like to give you the right name. So there's the cardiac stomach. See if I can find the correct name. Yeah, I'm can't think of the name, and I can't put my hand on it here in the book either. But I know there are two parts: there's the cardiac stomach, and then there's the other part of the stomach. And the way the sea star feeds is to invert the cardiac stomach out of the oral opening on the underside of the sea star, and release digestive enzymes into whatever it is that it's trying to eat, which is typically a bivalve. And those digestive enzymes then turn the body of the bivalve into a soup, which then sucks back into its stomach. Once it's finished feeding, it withdraws the cardiac stomach back into the body, leaving behind an empty shell. Now, you might ask, how can a sea star feed on a bivalve when the bivalves, as we've seen previously, have these very strong adductor muscles that hold the two valves, the shells, together? Well, this is the secret of the sea star. Part of it is because their muscles are very, very different to our muscles. And part of it is because of the nature of the echinoderm body plan, particularly seen in the sea star. So when a sea star encounters a bivalve that it wants to eat, the initial reaction of the bivalve is to clamp the shells shut because it recognizes the sea star as a predator. So the sea star crawls up on the bivalve over the opening of the shell and wraps its arms around and locks its feet onto the two shells. The clam, meanwhile, is desperately holding the shell shut with the adductor muscles, and they're very, very strong. So it's very easy for them to hold the shell shut against the sea star. But the sea star has a secret. It has the ability to lock its muscles in the contracted state. So once it wraps its arms around the bivalve, the clam, and locks its arms into place via the tube feet, it then contracts the muscles to start pulling on the shell and locks the muscles in that contracted state, which is now putting strain on the adductor muscles of the bivalve. But the sea star can do this indefinitely, whereas the bivalve has muscles like ours, and our muscles, like the bivalve muscles, get tired. And when they get tired, they can no longer contract. So all the sea star does is wait out its prey. And it will always win because it can sit there with its muscles locked in contraction, pulling against the shells as long as it wants to. And so eventually the clam tires and the adductor muscles give up, and the sea star opens up the shell, everts its stomach, and digests out the flesh of the clam and absorbs it back into the stomach. It's a very interesting way of tackling what would otherwise be a prey that was bound to defeat it. It has the patience to wait out its prey. And that actually raises another point that we now know about the lives of echinoderms, particularly sea stars, but echinoderms in general, that if it wasn't for the discovery of a retired dentist, quite by accident, we would never have realized. So this dentist was a scuba diver, and he was interested in underwater photography. And so when he retired, he started setting up his underwater cameras around the Santa Barbara region in California, and set them up to take a photo every couple of seconds. And when he collected his cameras, he then fed the photos into a graphics program that allowed him to run the images in sequence like a film, like a movie film. And it was only then, as he played these images and saw the life of the sea star, not in real time, but grossly speeded up as a consequence of using what we call now stop action photography, that the sea stars were very, very active. And once he realized what he was seeing, he took his footage along to the University of California, no, Cal State Santa Barbara. Was it Cal State? No, University of California Santa Barbara, not Cal State. And showed it to a couple of the biologists in the biology department. And they got very excited because no one knew that this was what the secret life of sea stars was like. And so in conjunction with the retired dentist, these biologists started investigating the secret life of echinoderms. And you can actually see some of the footage that was captured by the dentist, again, in one of the videos from The Shape of Life that's posted in the resources section for this chapter under the echinoderms. You can also see more footage that has been taken subsequently of the secret life of echinoderms, and you'll be quite amazed at just how active the sea stars truly are. In terms of behavior, they show the same sorts of behaviors that any other animal shows. They move around, they fight for dominance, they fight for access to food, they come and go, they chase their prey around, and you'll actually see footage of Pycnopodia chasing a couple of sea snails. It's just that they live their life at a much slower rate than we do, where we measure our lives in seconds and minutes, they measure their lives in hours and days. So unless you speed their life up to the same time scale as ours, you would never realize just how active they really are as animals. But that's part of the reason why they have radial symmetry. They don't need to move rapidly. They can move in any direction they want to. And they have a complete suite of sensory apparatus associated with each of the arms so that they can detect things in their environment, no matter in what direction they're moving or in what direction it's coming from. They have a complete 360-degree view of their habitat. So the clade that used to be separate was this group known as sea daisies. They used to have their own class, Concentricycloidea. Let me where up the pen. So formerly, Concentri. Now, we don't know very much about them, other than that there are 3 species. They live in very deep water off the edge of land masses, and they're always associated with submerged tree trunks, submerged timber. So we think they may actually be using that either as a substratum or as a food resource. It's not entirely clear. They were first found in a deep trench off the coast of New Zealand, where tree trunks had been washed out to sea from a river. They'd become waterlogged and sunk to the bottom. And when people were doing some underwater, deep water underwater photography, they came across these individuals or these organisms for the very first time. What makes them unique is the fact that they do not have tube feet like their sea star relatives, but they do have a pair of concentric water canals, which is where the name Concentricycloidea came from for their clade. And if you look really carefully, you can see that the body of this animal is divided up into 5 segments. I'm going to mark out the segments for you. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let me just put in this one and put in that one. So let me see if I've got that correct. I don't believe I have. There we go. So let me erase that line, because I've got one line in the wrong place. That's, oops. And again, that's the line that I want to put in. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's their 5-way radial symmetry. These were originally identified as asteroidea, then they were given their own clades, concentric cycloidea. They're now back amongst the asteroidea again. The brittle stars look somewhat like the sea stars, but their big difference is that the arms, instead of being very rigid, are quite flexible, and that allows them to move because they whip the arms around in a snake-like fashion that allows them to wriggle across the bottom. And different species of brittle stars have different feeding habits. You can see them listed here. They can be suspension feeders, they can be predators, they can be scavengers. They don't have the ability to anchor their feet in the way that a sea star does, so they just walk on their feet. They don't use them to attach to anything, so they're not considered to be suckers. They're just for walking on. So here's a typical sea star, and these can often group together, particularly those that are filter feeders, can group together in large collections, and they wave their arms in the water column to collect food particles, and it looks very much like some very, very delicate plant-like features waving in the water or waving in the air. It looks kind of cool. And again, you can see this in one of the videos that's posted to the resources section for this chapter, again, from The Shape of Life. The next group are the sea urchins and the sand dollars. So one of the ways that you can actually look at the diversity of echinoderms, and I want to move this away so that I can kind of draw a little diagram. So if we've got the sea stars, and the brittle stars to some degree as well fit into this. So if we've got the sea stars like that, and the brittle stars, if you take that and wrap the arms around like this in a 5-way fashion, what you wind up with is a sea urchin. So if you fold the arms under, you get a sea urchin. If you flatten it, dorsoventral, you get a sand dollar. So the sea urchin flattened becomes a sand dollar. And then if you take the sand dollar, tip it on its side and pull it out, go back. So if you pull it out longitudinally, you wind up with sea cucumber. The one clade that doesn't fit in here is what's called the feather star and the sea lily, which actually is a very, very ancient clade of echinoderms. They don't fit into this pattern, but they perhaps are either the origin of the brittle star, which developed into the sea star, or maybe the other way around. But we'll see the feather stars and the sea lilies shortly. So sea urchins and sand dollars are vegetarian, herbivorous. Particularly sea urchins are voracious feeders on seaweeds. In California and kelp forests, when sea urchins increase in numbers to plague proportions, they can devastate a kelp forest by eating it completely away in a matter of months because of the amount of material that they can digest. And they have a jaw-like apparatus made up of multiple hardened parts. If I remember rightly, there's about 3 parts involved in it, and they work like this, and they just shovel and grind away at seaweeds and shovel the material into their mouths, and they just keep eating and eating and eating. Again, you can watch them doing this in one of the videos posted to the resources page for this chapter. Again, it comes from the Shape of Life. So these are voracious feeders on seaweeds. And what they are most noted for, of course, is the spines on the surface. And you can see here that this sea urchin, which is called the royal crown sea urchin, is broken up into 5 parts. So there's part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then you've got the spines here, which are extensions of the underlying skeleton. In the case of some sea urchins, they really are spines, and they are very, very sharp, and they can penetrate through your skin quite easily. I remember encountering sea urchins like this walking on the reef when I lived in the South Pacific, in the Cook Islands. You had to be very, very careful, because if the spine broke off in your foot, it was a major source of infection, and there were only a certain limited selection of antibiotics that would actually cure the infection. Pretty nasty stuff, and very much a hazard if you were walking on the reef and you weren't paying attention to the sea urchins out there. Then you have the sea lilies and the feather stars. These are the oldest and most basal clade to the echinoderms. They've remained essentially unchanged from the fossilized species going all the way back to the Ordovician, which puts you about 500 million years ago. The big difference between sea lilies and feather stars is that sea lilies are sedentary. They attach to the substrate, usually a rock or something like that, and remain there for the rest of their life. Feather stars actually crawl around. They are not sessile, they are mobile. Now, there is a caveat to this. Some species of sea lilies can actually disengage from the substrate, flip themselves upside down so that they're like a feather star resting on their arms, and can actually crawl to a new location, flip themselves, quote unquote, upright again so that they can anchor back to the rock. But that's only a limited number of species. The vast majority of them remain anchored to their substrate. So here is an example of a sea lily, and you can see the attachment point that's anchoring it to this coral outcrop. And then they wave these arms around in order to capture food particles in the water column. And again, these can, like the brittle stars, cluster together in large colonies. And again, it looks like plant-like material waving in the water column, capturing food particles. Then we have the sea cucumbers, class Holothuroidea. When you look at these, and you can see one here, they don't look very much like an echinoderm at all. But when you look at them from the end, and you look very carefully, you can actually see that there are 5 ridges. Let me just make sure the pen is active here. So there are 5 large ridges. There's one there. There's another one here. This is a minor ridge. It's not a major ridge, but you work your way around and you can actually see that there are 5 ridges indicating the 5-way radial symmetry. They also have tube feet, but their tube feet are on the underside of the animal that allows them to crawl. They are very, very slow moving. Many of them look very drab and uninteresting, but some of them are very, very brightly colored. What is interesting is that if they are preyed upon, they have a very interesting way of defending themselves. They are able to secrete their guts out of their anus. And again, you can see an example of this in one of the videos that's posted in the resource page. You have a sea cucumber that actually excretes its guts, its digestive tract or parts of its digestive tract into the water. They flap around. They're more attractive to the predator than the sea cucumber, and it gives the sea cucumber a chance to escape. And like its sea star cousins, it's able to regenerate the parts that it sheds. Now, you could look at this one and go, yeah, very uninteresting, not sure that I want to eat it. When I was traveling around the world on my sabbatical in 2012, I had heard that sea cucumbers in Asia were considered to be a delicacy, that they were actually considered to be edible. And so when I was in Hong Kong, I had an opportunity to visit a traditional fishing village on one of the outlying islands. And as I was wandering through the village, I went down to the market just to see what was available for sale. And sure enough, in several of the booths, there were trays of dried and salted sea cucumbers that were available for sale and for consumption. No, I didn't buy any. I was not interested in consuming them, but I did find it interesting that they were there. So, yeah, it's interesting to look at different cultures and look at what they consider to be edible and to be delicacies. Likewise, sea urchins are considered to be delicacies amongst Polynesians. They will harvest them on the reef, use a rock to knock the spines off, and then crack the shell open and eat the innards raw. They treat it like candy. It's actually a reward for children who have been good. They treat it as candy. Interestingly enough, here in the West, we now consume sea urchins. Some of the major restaurants in New York and elsewhere use sea urchins and make a soup out of the innards and the gametes. And they often use the shell. They'll cut the top of the shell out and invert it upside down, because the opening is in the bottom on the oral side. The aboral side is completely sealed. And they use that as a soup bowl for serving the soup in. I've never tried it because I'm only a college professor. I can't afford high-end meals. But maybe one day after I retire, I might treat myself to trying some of these items just out of curiosity. But right now, not so much. So those are the echinoderms. That brings us to the last phylum amongst the deuterostomes that we're going to talk about, and that's the chordates. We are not going to go any further than this slide because we are going to cover these in the next presentation, the last presentation, which covers the chordates in detail, but spends a lot of time focused on the vertebrates. And I'm guessing that I'm probably going to have to split that up into 2 parts for recording purposes as well. Yes, I will have breaks in both parts with concept check questions, but I think it's going to take me both Tuesday afternoon and Thursday afternoon to record that, because while this chapter is long, chapter 34 is even longer. So you may have 2 separate postings for these recording sections for chapter 34 coming up next time. So we'll just have to wait and see how we go on that, but I'm pretty confident that I'm going to have to break it up into 2 sets of recordings. Anyway, the last couple of slides are just some tables that were taken from the textbook that outline the diversity of the animal kingdom and break out the various clades that we've referred to so far. Give you an idea of some of the key characteristics so that you have a way of piecing together some of the key ideas that you need to know for each of the major clades that we've talked about in this chapter and we'll continue to talk about in the next chapter. And then an enlarged section, 2 slides that takes that information for the clades that we've specifically addressed in this chapter, the invertebrate clades, and gives you some key features of each of the major clades that we've discussed amongst the Lophotrochozoans in this one, and the Ecdysozoans, and then the Deuterostomes. Giving you a little bit more detail on those, so it's a little bit easier to read. One more concept check question, and then we are done with this chapter. So how do the features of the diversity of echinoderms illustrate the unity and diversity of life, and how do these organisms match with their environment? So when you take a look at echinoderms, there are some basic features that are shared by all echinoderms. One is the presence of the underlying calcium carbonate reinforced endoskeleton, this plate structure. Also the presence of the hydraulic system in the vast majority of echinoderms, the radial symmetry that is associated with all echinoderms, the fact that they undergo a metamorphosis from a bilateral symmetry in the larval form to a radial symmetry in the adult form. Even the sea cucumbers, which initially may appear to be bilateral in symmetry, actually show radial symmetry once you look at them in the right way from the end rather than looking at them from the side. So all of those are common features. So there's some unity, but each of them have their own unique features that are adaptations to the environments that they choose to inhabit. So the sea stars have their behaviors that are associated with them as active predators, preying on sedentary prey or largely sedentary prey in the form of clams and mussels and oysters, but also chasing snails, which are themselves very slow. So the echinoderms do not have to move very fast in order to hunt down their prey because both move very slowly, but the echinoderms can move faster than the snails. Then you have the change in shape when you go from sea stars and brittle stars to sea urchins. Again, a change in body plan that allows them to be out and visible on the reef and protected, or in amongst the seaweeds and protected because of the spines, allows them to act as herbivores in the environment rather than active predators. They don't need to have the mobility that the sea stars have, so they are rather slow in movement. They tend to be a little bit more sedentary in their behaviors, but that is again because they are feeding on sedentary organisms, the seaweeds. The same is true with the sand dollars. When we get to the sea lilies and the feather stars, they are predominantly filter feeders. So they have lots of arms that allow them to harvest food particles out of the water column. They don't need to be terribly mobile. One class, sea lilies, is specifically largely not mobile because they're filter feeding. Then you have the Holothuroidea, there's the sea cucumbers. The one thing that I didn't mention about them is that they ingest sand from the seafloor. They crawl across the seafloor and ingest sand and extract organic matter out of the sand and excrete the waste back into the ocean again. And again, you can watch that happening on one of the videos posted to the resource section. It is estimated, and you may not feel comfortable with this, but this is what people have hypothesized, that every grain of sand on the seashore and on the floor of the ocean has passed through the gut of a sea cucumber at least once, because sea cucumbers have a very wide distribution in the oceans. They've been found at all levels, including the deepest part of the ocean, the Marianas Trench, feeding on organic matter that they harvest by sucking in sand, extracting the organic matter and squeezing it out, squeezing out the waste at the end, which is sand. I mean, they're ingesting sand and organic matter, extracting the organic matter and squeezing the sand back out again. So given the age of echinoderms going all the way back to shortly after the Cambrian explosion, and the long history in the fossil records of all echinoderms, including the sea cucumbers, that gives more than enough time for all the grains of sand on the beaches and on the floor of the ocean to have been ingested at least once by a sea cucumber. Think about that next time you're walking on the beach. Interesting thought. Anyway, that gives you a window on the diversity, but it also gives you some clues as to how the organisms match with their environment, that those diverse forms and the diverse behaviors that they show allow them to match with the environments that they live in and the habitats within those environments that they occupy. So that's it for the invertebrate side of the animal kingdom. Remember, that accounts for about 95% of the animal kingdom. We still have a couple of more invertebrate clades to discuss when we get to the chordates in the next chapter. But next time we discuss primarily the vertebrates, that small part, less than 5% of the animal kingdom that we represent. So until next time, if I don't see you, until then, be safe. Of course, if you have any concerns, questions or comments about anything that I've covered in this presentation, by all means, shoot me an email or come to office hours. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for the last chapter, chapter 34, the vertebrates and chordates.